when you look back at the grand sweep of human history, it is just incredibly easy to get distracted by the shifting lines on a map. We're naturally conditioned to look at the land, right?
Right, absolutely. We fixate on the continents.
Exactly. But for centuries, if you really wanted to understand where the ultimate power lay, you didn't look at the continents at all. You looked at the water. I mean, the fate of empires was basically decided at sea.
Oh, completely. Just look at the British Empire.
Yeah, they didn't build a global hegemony by, marching massive armies across Europe. They did it by ruling the oceans, controlling those vital trade routes.
And then the United States stepped onto the world stage and did the exact same thing, becoming this undisputed superpower through unmatched naval dominance.
Right, and right now, we're watching another massive pivot unfolding in real time. One that could, honestly, define the geopolitical landscape for the rest of this century.
It is arguably the most critical geopolitical drama happening today. Yet, because it's happening, over the horizon, it rarely dominates the front page of the daily news. We're looking at India,
which is the core focus of our deep dive today. We are pulling insights from this really fascinating framework laid out in Blue Horizons, India's quest for maritime supremacy.
Yeah, it's a great piece of source material.
It really is. And the mission today is to answer one defining question. Will India remain a continentally constrained nation focused almost entirely on its land borders, or is it going to transform into this dominant maritime superpower capable of shaping the entire Indo-Pacific?
And to really grasp the stakes here, we have to completely reorient our own thinking. When we watch the news, we naturally fixate on physical walls, troop movements, territorial disputes in the mountains.
We have this heavy bias toward terra firma.
Exactly, a massive land bias. But the true levers of global power, the massive trade routes, the energy flows, the technological supply chains, they are all floating on the oceans. In the 21st century, the nation that commands the seas commands the global economy itself.
Which is exactly why you, listening to this right now, really need to care about this shift.
Yeah.
Whether you're, prepping for a boardroom strategy meeting about global markets, analyzing international supply chains, or you just want to understand how the world map is being redrawn, this matters.
It matters a lot.
Because whoever ends up controlling the Indian Ocean ultimately controls the shipping lanes that bring you practically everything you rely on every single day.
Yeah, and to understand where India is heading, we have to start by looking at exactly where India sits on the map. And frankly, why it has historically kind of turned its back on its own front yard.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the geographic advantage here is just staggering. If you close your eyes and picture a map of the world, India is sitting at the absolute dead center of the Indian Ocean.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, it's this massive peninsula wedged perfectly between the Persian Gulf to the west and the Malacca Strait to the east.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer volume of movement between those 2 points. We're talking one of the largest concentrations of global trade and energy traffic in human history.
That's massive.
Oh, it's unprecedented. The oil flowing out of the Middle East to fuel Asian economies, the manufactured goods moving from Asian factories to European markets. Nearly all of these major maritime routes are geographically forced to pass through the waters directly adjacent to the Indian coast.
It is literally the ultimate geopolitical real estate. You essentially have the world's busiest commercial highway running right past your front porch.
It's a great way to put it.
And it's not just the mainland either. When you look at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India's strategic footprint extends incredibly deep into the ocean. Those islands sit right near the mouth of the Malacca Strait.
Yeah, acting as a natural geographic barrier. They function as a strategic gatekeeper. The Malacca Strait is the jugular vein of Asian commerce.
Right, because it's such a narrow bottleneck.
Exactly. Massive volumes of shipping are geographically forced into this highly predictable path. So any nation capable of monitoring, influencing, or potentially restricting movement through that strait holds just tremendous leverage over the economies of the entire Indo-Pacific.
It's like owning the only toll booth on the busiest interstate in the world. But here's the crazy part. For decades, the homeowner was entirely focused on guarding the backyard fence.
Yeah, it's true.
After gaining independence, India practically treated the oceans as a secondary, almost irrelevant theater.
Well, Yes, and the logic at the time was entirely driven by basic survival. Historically, India has been heavily land-focused because its immediate, existential threats were physical land borders with Pakistan and China.
Right.
When you have active conflicts in the Himalayas and across the plains, the army naturally dominates national strategic planning. Defense just meant putting boots on the ground to hold physical territory.
But the global economy doesn't run on Himalayan mountain passes.
Exactly, and that is the realization that is driving this massive shift today. Maritime power is pure economic power. Just consider that over 90% of India's trade by volume travels by sea.
Over 90%, wow.
Yeah, and it goes far beyond cargo ships, too. Think about the undersea internet cables. They carry 99% of international digital data.
Oh, right. The physical infrastructure of the internet.
Yes. The entire modern tech economy, banking systems, international communications, they all rely on fiber optic cables sitting right there on the ocean floor.
So if someone tampers with those cables or blockades those shipping lanes, the entire digital and physical economy just grinds to a halt.
Completely.
So if India wants to become a global economic heavyweight, national security and maritime security are essentially the exact same thing.
They are completely inseparable. You cannot protect an economy of that scale or project influence globally if you can't secure the waters that literally feed your nation.
But, recognizing a geographic advantage is one thing. Being forced to mobilize and actually act on it is another. If India was comfortable focusing on its land borders for decades, what broke the inertia?
Yeah.
Because when you look at the geopolitical chessboard, the immediate catalyst forcing this complete overhaul of strategy is obviously China. India realized it had to start looking out at the ocean because China was already heavily operating in it.
Yeah, no serious discussion about India's maritime future can exist without analyzing China's expansion. Over the last 2 decades, China has built one of the largest, most rapidly advancing naval forces in human history.
It's been wild to watch.
It really has. The People's Liberation Army Navy isn't just operating a coastal defense force anymore. They're deploying aircraft carriers, advanced guided missile destroyers, and nuclear-powered submarines far, far beyond their own shores.
And it's not just the hardware, right? It's where they're parking it. We're seeing a very calculated, strategic expansion across the Indian Ocean through what analysts call the string of pearls strategy.
String of pearls, exactly.
Yeah.
Because China isn't just sailing ships through. They're building hard access points and logistics hubs all across India's immediate maritime neighborhood. We're looking at massive developments in Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and a major military base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa.
Which naturally creates a profound feeling of strategic encirclement for New Delhi. The Indian Ocean, which India traditionally viewed as its own natural sphere of influence, is rapidly becoming the defining theater of India-China competition.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this for a second. If China is out there building ports and logistics hubs like, say, a massive infrastructure project in Sri Lanka, isn't that just global economics?
How do you know?
Well, countries invest in foreign infrastructure all the time to facilitate trade, right? Why does India view a commercial port project in a neighboring country as an immediate military threat?
That is the critical distinction we need to make here, and it comes down to the dual-use nature of modern maritime infrastructure.
Dual use?
Right. A deep-water port, built to handle massive commercial container ships, fundamentally requires massive physical specifications. It needs an incredibly deep draft, heavy-duty reinforced piers, massive gantry cranes.
Right.
Well, those are the exact same physical specifications required to dock, repair, and resupply a naval destroyer or an aircraft carrier.
Ah, I see. So a commercial port can be flipped into a naval base almost overnight because the concrete and the depth are already there.
And that is exactly what happened with Hambantota in Sri Lanka. It started as a commercial venture, heavily financed by Chinese loans. When Sri Lanka couldn't service that massive debt, Beijing essentially leveraged it into a 99-year lease of the port.
Oh, wow. A 99-year lease.
Yeah. So suddenly, a foreign superpower has operational control over a deep-water port located just a few dozen miles off India's southern coast. A plane that loads commercial cargo today can easily load munitions or supplies onto a warship tomorrow.
It's the ultimate Trojan horse strategy.
Precisely. China recognizes that India's greatest natural strategic advantage lies at sea. By establishing this string of pearls, China is systematically encroaching on that advantage.
So it's basically squeezing them in.
Yeah, it is this specific pressure The reality of Chinese naval assets operating out of ports right in their neighborhood that has forced India's maritime awakening. They realize they can no longer afford to just guard the land border while the ocean around them is being occupied.
So identifying the threat is the first step, but building the actual capacity to counter a superpower at sea, that is a completely different beast.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at how India is actively responding and the massive roadblocks standing in its way. Because if you want to push back against China's expansion, you need a blue water navy.
Right, and a blue water navy is a very specific capability threshold in naval warfare. It signifies a navy's ability to operate across deep, distant oceans for extended periods of time, sustaining complex military operations thousands of miles from their home ports.
Not just patrolling the local beaches.
Exactly. It is the fundamental difference between simply defending your own coastline and actively projecting power globally.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you think about it in sports terms, it's the difference between a team that can only play defense packed tightly inside their own penalty box, which is, your standard coastal defense force,
right,
versus a team that has the stamina, the logistics, and the skill to push up and control the entire midfield. That midfield control is true power projection.
That is a great way to visualize it. And India has made significant strides in pushing out into that midfield. The Indian Navy currently fields aircraft carriers, modern destroyers, and maritime patrol aircraft.
Right, they have some serious hardware.
They do. A massive symbolic and operational milestone was the commissioning of the INS Vikrant, which is their first indigenously built aircraft carrier.
It's a huge achievement. Yeah. Literally a floating city that acts as a mobile airbase. But when we dig into the operational reality, there are some glaring industrial bottlenecks, right? Like the ambition is there, but the manufacturing reality is struggling to keep pace.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, naval power is ultimately just a reflection of a nation's industrial and technological base. You cannot import your way to maritime supremacy.
You can't just buy a fleet online.
Exactly. Buying a state-of-the-art warship from Russia or France might look great on paper, but it creates a logistical nightmare.
Because in a protracted conflict, you're completely reliant on a foreign government for spare parts, maintenance schedules, software upgrades.
Exactly. If the supply chain gets cut, your fleet becomes completely non-operational. Long-term naval competitiveness requires indigenous shipbuilding. You need your own factories, your own steel, your own engineers.
And this is where the gap between India and China is currently the widest, isn't it?
By far. Chinese shipyards operate like a massive state-funded machine, churning out naval vessels at just an extraordinary speed. India's defense manufacturing ecosystem, while it is definitely improving, still wrestles with bureaucratic red tape, procurement delays, and significant inefficiencies.
Hold on. I'm doing the math here. Because India's defense bureaucracy is famous for taking over a decade to finalize basic procurement contracts.
It's notoriously slow, yeah.
So can they actually streamline that enough to match China's output? I mean, is it realistic to think they can just flip a switch and build shipyards that rival the Chinese machine?
Flipping a switch? No, definitely not. It requires a fundamental restructuring of how they integrate private industry with military procurement.
Like the Make in India initiative.
Right. That initiative is trying to bridge this gap, incentivizing private companies to build defense infrastructure. But you have to remember, it takes years, if not decades, to train the specialized workforce required for advanced naval engineering.
Which brings us to the second massive roadblock, and perhaps the most critical vulnerability of all, the submarine gap.
Ah, yes, the underwater domain.
Because modern naval warfare is increasingly moving underwater. The surface of the ocean is heavily monitored by satellites and drones, but the depths remain pretty opaque.
Submarines are arguably the most powerful strategic deterrents out there because they are incredibly difficult to track. And right now, India requires a much larger, more advanced underwater fleet to secure the Indian Ocean.
When you look at the current strategic thought, there is a massive urgency specifically for nuclear-powered attack submarines. Now, why nuclear specifically? Why not just build a massive fleet of traditional diesel-electric submarines? I mean, they are known to be incredibly quiet, right?
They are very quiet, but it all comes back to endurance and the mechanics of that blue water ambition we talked about.
Okay.
Diesel submarines are stealthy when they're running on batteries, but batteries drain. Eventually, the submarine has to surface or at least come to periscope depth to raise a snorkel, pull in oxygen, and run its loud diesel engines to recharge. Oh, and in that moment.
In that moment, they are highly vulnerable to detection by radar and maritime patrol aircraft. They basically announce their location.
Right. But a nuclear reactor, on the other hand, doesn't need oxygen.
Precisely. A nuclear-powered attack submarine generates its own power, and it even purifies its own water and air. It can stay submerged, operating at high speeds almost indefinitely.
The only limitation is, what, the amount of food on board for the crew?
Literally just the food. If you want to project power deep into the ocean and track adversary fleets for months at a time, you need nuclear propulsion. The undersea domain is where the future of the Indo-Pacific balance will likely be decided.
But even if India manages to build these shipyards, and even if they successfully deploy these nuclear submarines, it feels like they're preparing for the naval wars of the late 20th century.
What do you mean?
Well, isn't the very nature of maritime combat changing faster than they can weld these massive ships together? Which leads to the third major challenge: the future of warfare itself. That is the most complex variable in this entire equation. We talk about aircraft carriers like the INS Vikrant as ultimate symbols of power, but the reality is that a carrier is basically a massive floating piece of metal.
Right.
Future maritime dominance will not depend merely on counting the number of ships in your fleet.
Because we're looking at an entirely new technological ecosystem. We're talking about cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, autonomous drone swarms, hypersonic anti-ship missiles.
And we really need to understand the mechanism of how these technologies render traditional hardware obsolete.
Tell me more about that.
Well, you could have a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier, right? But if an adversary initiates a sophisticated cyber attack that spoofs the ship's GPS navigation or disables the targeting radar...
Then that carrier is no longer a strategic asset.
Exactly. It is simply a giant, blind, deaf target floating in the ocean.
Or consider AI. You have artificial intelligence systems now capable of analyzing billions of acoustic data points in the ocean, filtering out the background noise of whales and commercial shipping, to instantly identify the unique acoustic signature of an enemy submarine.
And this is exactly why the future Navy is an interconnected ecosystem. It is about data processing speed, electronic warfare, and network resilience, just as much as it is about firepower.
Okay, let's step back and look at the timeline here. Mastering indigenous shipyards, building a fleet of nuclear submarines, and seamlessly integrating AI and cyber warfare into a unified network.
Yeah.
I mean, that is easily a 50-year plan. If China parks a carrier strike group off the coast of Sri Lanka next year, India cannot wait for a shipyard to finish a decades-long project. What is their short-term play?
That's a great question. India cannot balance the scale against China alone in the short term, and they know it. But this localized challenge has created a massive global opportunity. Well, China's rapid, aggressive expansion has inadvertently done something remarkable. It has aligned the strategic interests of the rest of the world with India.
Right. You look at the map, and an entirely new global squad is forming. You have Japan, Australia, France, Vietnam, and the United States.
Exactly. All of these advanced naval powers are looking at the Indo-Pacific, looking at China's trajectory, and realizing that India is the essential geographic anchor they need to maintain the balance of power.
And this convergence of interests has resulted in an unprecedented boom in maritime cooperation. We're seeing incredibly complex joint military exercises, deep intelligence sharing, and major defense technology transfers that would have been unthinkable, say, 20 years ago.
Unthinkable. The most prominent example of this is the Quad framework, the strategic security dialogue between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia.
But we should be clear on what the Quad actually is, right? Because it is not an Asian NATO.
No, it is not a binding mutual defense treaty. If India gets into a conflict tomorrow, the U.S. and Japan are not legally obligated to send troops.
So what is it doing?
The Quad is about interoperability. It is about sharing satellite tracking data of Chinese submarine movements. It is about establishing secure joint supply chains for critical technologies. It proves that India is finally acting as a true, proactive Indo-Pacific maritime actor, rather than just a regional power nervously guarding its land borders.
So what does this all mean? Let's look at India's ultimate motives here. Are they actively trying to be the world's strategic shield in the Indo-Pacific? Like, are they willingly playing the role of the global bouncer to contain China on behalf of the West? Or are they just leveraging these global partnerships to buy time, get the necessary tech transfers, and build their own independent, standalone superpower status?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, and if you analyze India's historical foreign policy, the answer leans heavily toward the latter.
Superpower status.
Yeah. India is fiercely independent and highly pragmatic. They are utilizing this remarkably favorable strategic environment where every major Western power wants to share technology with them to fundamentally modernize their own infrastructure.
So they are using the security partnerships to build their economic engine.
Exactly. When India partners with the US or Japan on maritime security, they are essentially securing the shipping corridors that they need for their own exports.
Win-win for them.
Right. They are getting investment to upgrade their commercial ports. The naval modernization and the economic development are really two sides of the exact same coin. They are building the maritime architecture required to become a global manufacturing powerhouse.
So the end goal isn't just to be a loyal ally of the West. The end goal is absolute strategic autonomy.
They want to dictate the terms in the Indian Ocean, not just assist other powers in doing so.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together. When you look at the raw data, India currently possesses all the fundamental ingredients required to become a true global maritime power.
They really do.
They have the ultimate strategic geography sitting right over the world's busiest trade routes. They have a massive defensible coastline. They have the immense leverage of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands acting as the gatekeeper to the Malacca Strait. Plus, they have an exploding economic engine, a rapidly modernizing navy, and right now, they have an incredibly favorable global environment where the world's most advanced nations are eager to help them succeed.
But having the raw ingredients on the counter is not the same thing as successfully baking the cake. Geography and global goodwill alone do not automatically generate maritime dominance. True power projection requires strategic vision.
It's not just about whether an Indian shipyard can clear the bureaucratic red tape and weld steel faster than they did a decade ago.
No, it's about whether the nation can execute a coherent, unified maritime doctrine, a vision that seamlessly integrates hard military power, aggressive economic policy, subtle diplomatic maneuvering, and massive industrial capacity into one unified push.
And as we've seen historically, great maritime powers are not built overnight. They are built across generations.
It requires a sustained, focused effort that has to outlast individual political cycles and short-term economic fluctuations.
Which brings us entirely back to you, the listener. Tracking India's shipyard output, paying attention to their nuclear submarine acquisitions, watching their diplomatic maneuvers with the Quad over the next decade.
Right.
This isn't just obscure trivia for military geeks and history professors. What we are watching is a live, real-time preview of how the global economy is going to be governed in our lifetimes.
Absolutely.
The nations that dominate the seas dictate the terms of global trade. Will India remain a continental power forever tangled in regional land disputes? Or will they successfully pivot to the sea and emerge as the defining maritime civilization of the Indo-Pacific century?
It is the choice that will fundamentally define the balance of power in Asia. But looking forward, it also leaves us with a fascinating, rarely discussed consequence to ponder.
What's that?
Well, suppose India executes this perfectly. Suppose over the next few decades, they build this multi-generational maritime doctrine, close the technology gaps, and achieve true, undisputed dominance over the entire Indian Ocean. How will the traditional historical naval powers react to that reality?
You mean powers like the British Empire historically or the United States today, who have essentially policed those waters for a century?
Exactly. Right now, the U.S. and its allies are eager to help India because they share a common adversary in China. But if India becomes the undeniable sovereign master of its maritime domain, will those traditional powers willingly share control of the global seas? Or will an entirely new kind of geopolitical friction emerge between today's closest allies once India no longer needs them to balance the scales?
Wow. A pivot from the land to the sea and a dramatic shift in who actually holds the compass. It is a massive transition and something we all definitely need to keep a close eye on.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.